From signing autographs as Marlon Brando to faking his own death to terrify directors, Paul Newman's off-camera antics were as legendary as his blue-eyed performances. The racing fanatic who mixed salad dressing with canoe paddles and proudly displayed his spot on Nixon's enemies list had secrets that would shock even his biggest fans. Here are 15 things you never knew about Paul Newman from Hollywood's golden age. Fact 1. Mixed first salad dressing with canoe paddle. Paul Newman's journey to becoming a salad dressing mogul began in the most unlikely way possible during the winter of 1980. The Hollywood legend was hanging out in a derelict barn on his Connecticut property with his close friend and writer A.E. Hotchner, mixing up what would become the very first batch of Newman's own salad dressing. What started as a simple plan to create homemade Christmas gifts for friends and neighbors turned into one of the most bizarre origin stories in food history. Newman had developed quite a reputation among his friends for his salad dressing obsession. Whenever he dined out at fancy restaurants, he would politely ask the staff for olive oil, vinegar, mustard, and fresh black pepper, then proceed to mix up his own personal dressing right at the table, much to the bemusement of other diners and restaurant staff, who probably thought he was just another eccentric Hollywood actor indulging himself. But on this particular December day, Newman and Hotchner found themselves facing a practical problem while preparing their large batch of dressing in the barn. They had assembled all the ingredients in a big wash tub, but realized they had absolutely nothing to stir the mixture with. That's when Newman had his moment of improvised genius. He walked outside the barn to the nearby river, grabbed his canoe paddle, and returned to start churning the salad dressing ingredients together. Hotchner later admitted they were incredibly fortunate that nobody died from eating their canoe paddle mixed creation, considering the completely unsterile environment they were working in. The mixture was poured into old wine bottles and distributed as holiday gifts, becoming so popular among recipients that Newman eventually spotted bottles being sold as hot items in local grocery stores. This accidental discovery led to the official launch of Newman's Own in 1982, a company that has since donated over $600 million to charity worldwide. Fact 2. Colorblind Navy reject became speed demon. Paul Newman's dreams of soaring through the skies as a Navy pilot were crushed by a simple eye test, but this devastating rejection eventually led him to find his true calling on the racetrack. After graduating from high school in 1943, Newman eagerly enrolled in the Navy's V-12 pilot training program at Yale University, hoping to serve his country as an aviator during World War II. However, during his flight physical examination, military doctors discovered that Newman was colorblind, which immediately disqualified him from ever flying a plane for the Navy. The rejection was particularly ironic considering that Newman's striking blue eyes would later become one of his most famous features as a Hollywood leading man. He was reassigned to serve as a radioman and gunner instead, but his passion for speed and adrenaline never disappeared. After the war ended and Newman began building his acting career, he found an unexpected outlet for his need for speed through automobile racing, which began almost by accident. The transformation from grounded Navy recruit to racing legend started when Newman was preparing for his role in the 1969 film Winning, where he played a race car driver. The movie required him to learn about professional racing, and Newman discovered he had a natural talent and genuine passion for the sport that went far beyond just acting preparation. Newman launched his professional racing career in 1972 at Thompson International Speedway, quietly entering races under the name P.L. Newman, to avoid drawing attention to his celebrity status. He went on to win 4 national championships in the Sports Car Club of America and achieved one of his greatest racing accomplishments in 1979 when he finished second in the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans race, one of the most prestigious endurance races in the world. Even more remarkably, at age 70, Newman became the oldest driver ever to be part of a winning team in the 1995 Daytona 24 Hours sports car endurance race, proving that his rejected pilot dreams had evolved into something even more extraordinary. Fact 3. Kicked off football team for fighting. Paul Newman's legendary acting career might never have happened if he hadn't gotten into a fight that cost him his athletic scholarship and completely changed the direction of his life. After returning from his Navy service in 1946, Newman enrolled at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, on a football scholarship, planning to pursue his original dream of becoming a professional athlete rather than an entertainer. Newman had been a talented football player throughout high school and college before enlisting in the military, and he genuinely believed that sports would be his ticket to success after the war ended. He was excited to get back on the field and continue building his athletic career at Kenyon College, where he hoped to develop his skills enough to eventually play professional football. However, Newman's hot temper and tendency toward mischief got the better of him during his time at the college. He became involved in some kind of altercation that escalated into a physical fight, leading to his arrest by local authorities. The exact details of what sparked the confrontation have never been fully revealed, but the consequences were immediate and life-changing for the future Hollywood star. When college officials learned about Newman's arrest, they made the decision to kick him off the football team, which automatically meant losing his athletic scholarship. Suddenly finding himself without his planned path forward and needing to figure out how to pay for his education, Newman was forced to completely reconsider his future plans. Since he was determined not to focus too heavily on his academic studies, Newman made what seemed like a casual decision at the time to switch his major to theater for his final 2 years at college. In a 1998 interview with Interview magazine, Newman reflected on this turning point in his life, saying, "I got thrown in jail and kicked off the football team. Since I was determined not to study very much, I majored in theater the last 2 years. This seemingly minor academic change set Newman on the path that would eventually lead him to become one of Hollywood's most beloved and successful actors, proving that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come from our biggest mistakes." Fact 4. Proudly framed Nixon's enemies list certificate. Paul Newman was absolutely delighted to discover that he was the only actor among the 20 names on President Richard Nixon's original enemies list, and he proudly displayed the official document in his home like a treasured award. The infamous list was compiled in 1971 by Nixon's special counsel Charles Colson and was designed to identify major political opponents who the administration wanted to target through tax audits and other forms of federal harassment. Newman earned his spot on the list due to his outspoken political activism during the turbulent 1960s, particularly his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for liberal causes including gay rights and nuclear disarmament. He had actively campaigned for Democratic candidates Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 presidential election, using his celebrity status to appear in nationwide television commercials that effectively promoted anti-Nixon messages. The list became public knowledge during the Watergate hearings in June of 1973, when White House counsel John Dean mentioned its existence during his testimony. The original memo explained that the purpose was to use available federal machinery to screw our political enemies, and Newman was listed as number 19 with the notation "radical lib causes." Heavy McCarthy involvement in '68, used effectively in nationwide TV commercials. 72 involvement certain. When Newman received a copy of the document, he was genuinely thrilled rather than concerned about being targeted by the federal government. According to his daughter Nell Newman, who spoke about this in a 2009 interview, her father was tickled pink and framed it because he viewed inclusion on the list as validation of his political principles and effectiveness as an activist. Newman reportedly considered his spot on Nixon's enemies list to be one of his greatest accomplishments, ranking it alongside his 10 Academy Award nominations as achievements he was most proud of. His reaction reflected his belief that a man with no enemies is a man of no character, and he wore his political opposition to Nixon as a badge of honor rather than something to hide from or be ashamed about. Fact 5. Signed autographs as Marlon Brando. Paul Newman had such a mischievous sense of humor that when fans regularly mistook him for Marlon Brando during the early years of his career, he would cheerfully play along with the case of mistaken identity rather than disappoint them by revealing the truth. This happened frequently throughout the 1950s, when both actors were young, dark-haired leading men who shared similar brooding good looks and intense acting styles that made them easy to confuse from a distance. The mix-ups occurred so often that Newman developed a standard routine for handling these encounters with starstruck fans who approached him on the street or in restaurants asking for autographs. Instead of awkwardly correcting them and potentially embarrassing the fans who had made the mistake, Newman would graciously fulfill their requests by signing autographs with the message, "Best wishes, Marlon Brando," in his own handwriting. This playful deception revealed Newman's naturally easygoing personality and his ability to find humor in the sometimes absurd situations that came with being a Hollywood celebrity. Rather than being offended by the constant comparisons to Brando or frustrated by the frequent cases of mistaken identity, Newman seemed to genuinely enjoy the confusion and turned it into an ongoing private joke. The fact that Newman was so frequently confused with Brando actually made sense during this period of their careers, since both actors were part of the same generation of method actors who brought a new style of naturalistic, emotionally intense performances to Hollywood films. They were both considered rising stars who represented a departure from the more polished, traditional leading men of previous decades. Newman's willingness to sign fake Brando autographs also demonstrated his lack of ego about his own fame and his understanding that disappointing fans was worse than perpetuating a harmless case of mistaken identity. This habit continued until Newman became famous enough in his own right that the mix-up stopped happening, but it remains a perfect example of the kind of good-natured pranks and practical jokes that would characterize his personality throughout his entire career. Fact 6. Begged people not to watch his film. Paul Newman was so mortified by his Hollywood debut in The Silver Chalice that he took the extraordinary step of paying for newspaper advertisements to actively discourage people from watching it when the film was scheduled to air on television 9 years later. Newman's first starring role came in 1954 when he was cast as a Greek silversmith who creates a cup to commemorate Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, but the entire experience turned into a nightmare that haunted him for years afterward. The production was plagued with problems from the very beginning, as Newman constantly clashed with director Victor Seville and never felt comfortable with any aspect of the filmmaking process, from delivering his dialogue to riding a camel in desert scenes. Newman later described the film as the worst movie to be made in the entirety of the 1950s, and he genuinely believed that his career might be over before it had even properly begun. While most actors try to forget about their early mistakes and hope that audiences will do the same, Newman was horrified to learn in 1963 that a Los Angeles television station was planning to broadcast The Silver Chalice during prime time. By this point, Newman had successfully rebuilt his reputation with acclaimed performances in films like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and The Hustler, and he was terrified that viewers would see his embarrassing debut and think less of him as a serious actor. In a desperate attempt to prevent this disaster, Newman purchased advertisement space in 2 major Hollywood newspapers and published a public apology that read, "Paul Newman apologizes every night this week, Channel 9. The ads essentially begged television viewers not to tune in to watch his early film failure, hoping to minimize the damage to his carefully constructed image as a respected leading man. However, Newman's plan completely backfired in the most spectacular way possible, as curious viewers became fascinated by the idea of seeing a movie that was apparently so terrible that a major movie star was willing to pay money to warn people away from it, resulting in massive television ratings that far exceeded what the film would have received without Newman's well-intentioned warning. Fact 7. Fake death to terrorize directors. Paul Newman took his love of practical jokes to absolutely terrifying extremes by repeatedly staging his own death during film productions, using life-size dummies that looked exactly like him to convince directors that he had accidentally fallen to his death from dangerous heights. This incredibly elaborate and disturbing prank became Newman's signature move when he wanted to get back at directors who had frustrated him or refused to make script changes he had requested. The most dramatic example of this fake death stunt occurred during the filming of Exodus in 1960 when Newman was working with director Otto Preminger, who was known for being difficult and demanding on set. During a fight scene that was supposed to take place on a balcony, Newman secretly arranged for a realistic dummy of himself to be thrown off the building while cameras were rolling, making it appear as though he had accidentally fallen during the action sequence. When Preminger saw what he believed was Newman's body plummeting to the ground below, the director was so shocked and horrified that he immediately collapsed and required first aid from the film crew. The prank was so convincing and traumatic that Preminger genuinely thought he had just witnessed the death of his leading man, and the psychological impact of the experience left him shaken for the rest of the production. Rather than learning his lesson from the extreme reaction his prank had caused, Newman decided to repeat the exact same stunt years later during the filming of The Macintosh Man in 1973. While shooting a scene that took place 60 feet off the ground, Newman once again had a dummy version of himself pushed off the edge in front of director John Huston, who also believed he was witnessing a fatal accident. Huston immediately yelled, "Cut!" and rushed to the scene of what he thought was a terrible tragedy, only to discover that Newman was perfectly safe and had orchestrated the entire thing as another one of his elaborate practical jokes. Both incidents demonstrated Newman's willingness to go to shocking lengths to prank directors, even if it meant traumatizing them in the process. Fact 8. Nearly died from pilot's ear infection. Paul Newman's entire future as a Hollywood legend hinged on a simple ear infection that saved his life during one of the most dangerous battles of World War II. In 1945, Newman was serving as a radio man and gunner aboard torpedo bombers in the Pacific Theater, and his unit had been assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, along with other replacement crews, shortly before the Battle of Okinawa. Newman and his crew were scheduled to fly a dangerous mission as part of the American offensive against Japanese forces, but on the day they were supposed to depart for combat, their pilot developed a severe ear infection that prevented him from flying. Military regulations required that the entire crew be grounded when the pilot was unable to perform his duties, so Newman and the other members of his aircraft crew were forced to remain behind while the rest of their squadron transferred to the Bunker Hill to participate in the scheduled operations. This seemingly minor medical issue turned out to be a miraculous stroke of fortune that would change the course of history. Just days after Newman's squadron flew to the aircraft carrier without him, Japanese kamikaze pilots launched a devastating attack on the USS Bunker Hill that killed several hundred American sailors and airmen in one of the war's most deadly single incidents. Among the casualties were the other members of Newman's unit who had made the flight that Newman missed due to his pilot's ear infection. The entire squadron that Newman would have been part of was wiped out during the kamikaze attack, meaning that a simple medical problem had literally saved the future actor's life and allowed him to survive the war. Newman later reflected on this incredibly close call with death, understanding that he had been just one ear infection away from never making it home from the Pacific. The random nature of his survival became one of those astonishing pieces of luck that defined an entire generation of World War II veterans, and it meant that the world would eventually get to experience all of Newman's legendary performances that might never have existed. Fact 9. Cut director's car and desk in half. Paul Newman turned his ongoing prank war with director George Roy Hill into an escalating series of destructive stunts that literally involved sawing the man's personal property in half with power tools. Hill became Newman's favorite target for elaborate practical jokes, after directing him in 3 major films, and Newman seemed to take special pleasure in finding increasingly outrageous ways to mess with the director's belongings during production. The destructive pranks began during the filming of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, when Newman decided that ordinary jokes weren't enough to express his mischievous feelings toward Hill. Instead of settling for simple pranks like fake spiders or whoopee cushions, Newman enlisted the help of the film crew to literally cut Hill's office desk completely in half using saws, leaving the director to discover his workspace had been destroyed when he arrived for work the next morning. Not content with just ruining Hill's furniture, Newman escalated the prank to an even more expensive and shocking level by targeting the director's personal automobile. Using the same approach he had taken with the desk, Newman arranged for Hill's car to be sawed directly down the middle, creating 2 useless halves of what had previously been a functioning vehicle, and leaving Hill with a completely destroyed automobile that would need to be entirely replaced. Newman repeated these destructive pranks during the filming of The Sting in 1973, once again targeting both Hill's desk and car, with the same saw-them-in-half approach that had worked so effectively during their previous collaboration. The fact that Newman was willing to destroy expensive property just for the sake of a practical joke demonstrated the extreme lengths he was prepared to go to in order to get a laugh and maintain his reputation as Hollywood's most dedicated prankster. Hill apparently took these expensive and destructive pranks in good humor, since he continued working with Newman on multiple films despite having his personal property repeatedly destroyed, suggesting that their professional relationship was strong enough to survive even the most outrageous practical jokes that Newman could devise. Fact 10. Has most valuable Rolex nickname. Paul Newman accidentally created one of the most valuable and sought-after collectible watches in the world simply by wearing a particular style of Rolex Daytona that his wife Joanne Woodward had given him as a gift. The watch became so closely associated with Newman that collectors and auction houses around the globe now refer to this specific model as the Paul Newman Daytona, and vintage examples regularly sell for well over $100,000 at prestigious watch auctions. The story began when Woodward purchased a Rolex Daytona reference 6239 for her husband, who had developed a serious passion for automobile racing and needed a reliable timepiece for timing his laps on the racetrack. This particular model featured what Rolex officially called an exotic dial in their catalogs, which had a distinctive Art Deco font and square markers that made it visually different from the standard Daytona designs that were more commonly seen. The watch might have remained just another racing timepiece if not for a photograph that appeared in an Italian magazine during the 1980s, showing Newman wearing his Daytona while promoting one of his films. Watch collectors and enthusiasts around the world noticed the unique dial design and began referring to any Daytona with similar features as a Paul Newman, completely abandoning Rolex's original exotic designation in favor of the more memorable celebrity nickname. What made this naming phenomenon particularly remarkable was that the exotic dial Daytonas had originally been some of the least popular models when they were first produced in the mid-1960s, with many watch dealers struggling to sell them because customers preferred the cleaner, more traditional dial designs. However, once the Paul Newman Association was established, demand for these formerly unwanted watches exploded among collectors, who suddenly viewed them as the most desirable Rolex models ever made. The irony of Newman's influence on watch collecting is that he probably never realized he was wearing what would become one of the most valuable timepieces in history, since he simply chose the watch because it was practical for his racing activities, rather than because of any particular interest in luxury watch collecting or investment potential. Fact 11. Accidentally killed 300 chickens in prank. Paul Newman's love of elaborate practical jokes turned into an unintentional animal tragedy when he arranged for 300 live chickens to be delivered to director Robert Altman's trailer, only to have all of the birds die from heat exposure while Altman was away from the set. This particular prank was meant to be Newman's response to what he considered Altman's cheap hospitality during a dinner party where the director had served terrible wine to the cast and crew. The chicken delivery was supposed to be a harmless but memorable way for Newman to get back at Altman for his poor hosting skills, and Newman had carefully planned the timing so that the director would discover the surprise when he returned to his trailer after filming. The idea was that Altman would open his trailer door to find hundreds of live chickens clucking around inside his personal space, creating chaos and mess, but no actual harm to anyone involved. Unfortunately, Newman's timing went disastrously wrong when Altman ended up being away from his trailer much longer than expected, leaving the 300 chickens trapped inside the enclosed space during what turned out to be an extremely hot day on the film set. Without proper ventilation or access to water, the birds quickly succumbed to heat exhaustion and died, transforming Newman's intended harmless prank into an accidental mass killing of innocent animals. When Newman discovered what had happened to the chickens, he was genuinely horrified by the unintended consequences of his practical joke and immediately took full responsibility for the disaster. The smell and mess created by 300 dead chickens made Altman's trailer completely unusable, so Newman paid to have it entirely replaced at his own expense as an apology for the terrible outcome of his prank. The incident didn't end Newman's pranking relationship with Altman, however, as the director later retaliated by serving cheap wine at another dinner party, prompting Newman to have a live goat delivered to the set with a note attached to its collar that read, "Dear Bob, since what you serve at dinner is goat piss, you may as well have one handy." Fact 12. Left tricky note for Nixon. Paul Newman and future President Richard Nixon unknowingly shared the same luxury automobile through a bizarre coincidence that gave Newman the perfect opportunity to play a politically charged practical joke on his future political enemy. The situation arose when both men were using the services of the same car dealer who had a policy of loaning expensive Jaguar automobiles to high-profile clients as a form of marketing and customer service. Newman had arranged to borrow one particular Jaguar on Fridays through Sundays for his personal use, while Nixon had been given access to the exact same vehicle on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, creating a schedule that allowed both men to drive the same car without either of them initially realizing they were sharing it with someone else. The car dealer apparently saw this arrangement as an efficient way to maximize the use of his loaner vehicles while keeping both celebrity clients happy. When Newman eventually discovered that the presidential candidate was his co-driver, he decided to take advantage of this unexpected connection by leaving a message that would let Nixon know exactly who else had been behind the wheel. Newman's sense of humor and political opposition to Nixon inspired him to craft a note that would be both informative and subtly insulting at the same time. The message Newman left in the car read, "Dear Mr. Nixon, you should have no trouble driving this car. It has a tricky clutch. Paul Newman." The word tricky was Newman's clever reference to Nixon's well-known political nickname, Tricky Dick, which had been given to him by opponents who considered him dishonest and willing to use underhanded tactics to achieve his goals. Nixon apparently did not appreciate Newman's wordplay and held a grudge against the actor from that point forward, which helps explain why Newman eventually earned his coveted spot on Nixon's enemies list several years later. The incident perfectly captured Newman's willingness to inject his political beliefs into everyday situations and his talent for turning ordinary encounters into opportunities for mischief and protest. Fact 13. Epic car prank war with Redford. Paul Newman and Robert Redford engaged in one of the most expensive and elaborate prank wars in Hollywood history, involving the destruction and transformation of an entire automobile that escalated through multiple rounds of increasingly creative revenge schemes. The battle began when Redford grew completely fed up with Newman's obsession with car racing, which had become such a dominant topic of conversation that Redford could barely stand spending time with his friend without hearing endless details about engines, lap times, and racing strategies. For Newman's 50th birthday, Redford decided to send a message about his feelings toward Newman's racing obsession by arranging for a completely destroyed Porsche shell to be gift-wrapped with a ribbon and delivered directly to Newman's front porch in Connecticut. The crushed vehicle was meant to be a humorous commentary on what Redford saw as the inevitable outcome of Newman's dangerous racing hobby, and he expected his friend to either laugh at the joke or get annoyed and throw the wreckage away. However, Newman had no intention of letting Redford get the last word in their prank war, so he arranged for the demolished Porsche to be taken to a metal foundry where it was melted down into a solid block of metal. Newman then had this compacted block of what used to be Redford's gift carefully packaged in a large wooden crate and delivered directly into the living room of Redford's rented house in Westport, Connecticut, where it was heavy enough to actually dent the floor when it was set down. Still not satisfied with his revenge, Newman took the prank to its final and most artistic level by hiring a sculptor friend to transform the metal block into what Redford later described as an incredibly ugly garden sculpture. 3 weeks after the living room delivery, Newman had the bizarre metal artwork transported by towing service and permanently installed in Redford's garden, where it served as a constant reminder of their ongoing friendship and their shared commitment to taking practical jokes to absolutely ridiculous extremes. Fact 14. Gave away salary for pay equity. Paul Newman demonstrated his commitment to fairness and equality in Hollywood by voluntarily giving up a portion of his own salary when he discovered that he and his male co-star were being paid significantly more than their female colleague, despite all three actors receiving equal billing in the film. This act of generosity occurred during the production of Twilight in 1998, a crime drama that starred Newman alongside Gene Hackman and Susan Sarandon in what were supposed to be equally important leading roles. Newman was genuinely surprised to learn that the film's payment structure was so unequal, since the marketing materials and credits clearly presented all three actors as co-stars, rather than positioning him and Hackman as the primary leads with Sarandon in a supporting role. The discovery that he and Hackman were both earning considerably more money than Sarandon for what appeared to be equivalent work struck Newman as fundamentally unfair and inconsistent with the way the film was being presented to audiences. Rather than simply expressing disapproval or suggesting that the producers should handle the situation, Newman took direct personal action by offering to redistribute his own earnings to create a more equitable payment arrangement. He proposed giving up a portion of his salary so that Sarandon would receive compensation that better reflected her equal status in the production, essentially using his own money to correct what he saw as an injustice in the film's financial structure. Sarandon later spoke about Newman's gesture during a 2018 interview with the BBC, confirming that Newman had indeed made this generous offer and explaining how much his willingness to sacrifice his own earnings had meant to her both personally and professionally. The incident reflected Newman's broader commitment to social justice and equality, which had been consistent themes throughout his life in his political activism, charitable work, and business practices. Newman's decision to address pay inequality through personal financial sacrifice was particularly remarkable because it occurred decades before widespread public discussions about gender pay gaps in Hollywood, making him ahead of his time in recognizing and actively working to correct these disparities. Fact 15. Voice lived on in Cars 3. Paul Newman's voice made a remarkable return to the big screen 9 years after his death, when Disney Pixar used previously unused audio recordings from the original Cars movie to bring his character Doc Hudson back for Cars 3 in 2017. Newman had provided the voice for Doc Hudson, a retired race car who becomes a mentor to the main character Lightning McQueen, in the first Cars film released in 2006, which turned out to be his final role in a major animated feature and one of his last film performances before retiring from acting. When Newman originally recorded his dialogue for the first Cars movie, The voice actors typically recorded much more material than what actually ended up in the final version of the film, including alternate takes, extended conversations, and additional lines that were ultimately cut during the editing process. These extra recordings were carefully preserved in Disney's archives, creating an unexpected treasure trove of Newman's voice work that could potentially be used in future projects. The decision to incorporate Newman's archived voice recordings into Cars 3 was both a creative choice and a tribute to the beloved actor, allowing filmmakers to maintain continuity with the original character while honoring Newman's contribution to the franchise. The unused dialogue was skillfully edited and integrated into new scenes, creating the illusion that Newman had actually returned to record fresh material for the sequel, even though he had passed away years earlier. This posthumous performance was particularly meaningful because Cars 3 served as a conclusion to Lightning McQueen's story arc and featured Doc Hudson as a central figure in flashback sequences that explored the mentor and relationship between the two characters. Newman's presence in the film allowed the story to come full circle and provided emotional weight to the narrative that would not have been possible without his distinctive voice. The use of archival recordings to create new performances has become increasingly common in modern filmmaking, but Newman's appearance in Cars 3 remains one of the most touching examples of this technology being used to honor a legendary performer's legacy.